Hello and welcome to PCI Webinars. Today's webinar, Comics, Superheroes, and Pop Culture in Your Library with Brian Reel. Brian is a public services librarian for the Calvert Library, a public library system in rural southern Maryland. He holds a Master's of Library Science and a PhD in Information Studies from the University of Maryland, where he currently teaches graduate courses in public libraries and reference services. Brian served as the lead author of the report Rural Libraries in the United States, Recent Strides, Future Possibilities, and Meeting Community Needs, which was published by the American Library Association in the summer of 2017. He also edited the volume Rural and Small Public Libraries, Challenges and Opportunities for the Advances in Librarianship book series, which was published in November of 2017. Coming to you now from Maryland, it's Brian Reel.
All right, thank you very much. So let's go ahead and skip to the slide where you get to see me a little bit more. That's me in my lovely Ninja Turtles outfit at a Halloween event that we did in Calvert County. The Ninja Turtles are not technically superheroes, but they have very superhero-like elements, including being from comic books. So part of why I wanted to do this is that I write and I do research on other areas, and I'm actually going to be transitioning to be an assistant professor of library science at Southern Connecticut State University this fall. But I've been an avid comic book fan for years. I used to be the comic book purchaser for the public library system with which I'm employed, and I just wanted to be able to talk about comics for an hour. So I'm going to go over some of the basics of what comics are, what the fandom surrounding them constitutes. And this is going to be mainly oriented towards public libraries, but if you have questions or want to gear it towards, I'm seeing some university libraries and so forth, please ask questions, and I will try to pivot that way. Also, one assumption worth noting, I think that many of you know that comics are released as individual issues and then collected as what they usually call trade paperbacks, so that you get a full story arc, usually about 4 to 7 issues, collected together. I'm assuming that most of you are buying the collected editions. I know that some larger systems can justify buying the individual issues. They have enough traffic and have enough funding. But for the most part, we are going to be oriented towards what you can buy that goes on a bookshelf. This is also going to be focused primarily on superheroes. There are other comic forms, such as many independent comics, completely different genres outside of the superhero area, manga as well. But I think that there's so many trainings out there that try to show that comics do this broader sweep beyond superheroes that we often miss talking about the superheroes, the core of the market that constitutes about 70-some% of the comic book market. So with that said, let's begin. So we should start with the two big publishers, because they're not just publishers, they're also universes. And you've seen this now in some of the movies, which didn't used to be the case. Superheroes in different movies used to stay separate. But one of the big universes is Marvel, that has all of the Avengers characters that you've seen in movies, including Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Hulk, Black Widow, but also X-Men and Spider-Man, which are kind of their own thing a lot of the time. And we'll get into why that is in a couple moments. And then we have DC, which stands for Detective Comics, but they've been using exclusively the abbreviation since the 70s. And that includes all of the Justice League characters. So Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Green Lantern, and Aquaman are not only published by the same company, but they're supposed to exist in the same universe. So Gotham City and Metropolis are supposed to exist in the same version of the United States. Now, briefly, I want to jump to some of the other guys. There's a good number of other comic publishers out there that we're not going to talk about that much today. Valiant is one of them, which is quite interesting. It was a company that was started by former Marvel staff at the end of the 1980s, bought out by a video game company in 1994 that kind of drove the company into the ground, frankly. And then the properties that had been created were sold to other holders in 2012, and all of the characters and their stories were rebooted. So you have some stuff that I assume most of you haven't heard of, like Bloodshot, Exo Manowar, Rye, Shadow Man, Harbinger, etc. These are all excellent comics, and Valiant is doing some interesting award-winning stuff. One thing that I would encourage you to look up is a series called Faith, which is about a female superhero that does not follow the usual muscular, lean, traditional style of attractiveness. And we may see much more of the Valiant characters in the coming years because Sony Pictures has made a deal to produce movies that will be creating another universe. So just like Marvel has their Avengers universe that everybody is inhabiting the same world, DC has the same thing with the recent Justice League film. Every major film studio wants to do that. The only properties that weren't really picked up that really work with that idea, at least for superheroes, were Valiant, so that'll be coming soon. Likewise, Image Comics, they have some superhero properties. They were started by a group of former Marvel and DC artists and writers back in '92. Spawn was popular back in the '90s. There's a series that is, I think, just now concluding, actually, called Invincible, which is a superhero book by Robert Kirkman, who created The Walking Dead. But Image is moving more and more away from the superheroes. They're now publishing The Walking Dead as their huge hit. Another book called Saga, which is excellent. It's a sci-fi thing. But for the most part, we're going to be looking at these two guys. So, back to what DC is. I already mentioned it stands for Detective Comics. DC has the honor of having created the first superhero, which of course is Superman. Here you can see him throwing a car at a rock. Superman first premiered in Action Comics #1 in 1938. Batman came around the next year, kind of as a copy of Superman. The cape and things like that had become popular. And yes, I see somebody just mentioned Action Comics 1000, exactly. So you can see that the next year was Detective Comics 27. The reason that it was already up to 27 is that DC was mainly publishing detective books, detective and cop stories, etc., and decided to do a superhero character in one issue to see how it went, and we know the rest of the story. And both Action Comics and Detective Comics are still being published today. Warner Brothers bought out DC back in the 1970s. And just a couple years ago, DC had always been in New York City. They're now out in California, their editorial offices are. So this is tying in the movies, the comics, the video games, everything in the same area. And we're going to talk about what that means in terms of fandom. Meanwhile, Marvel was originally called Timely Comics and started in 1939 when Superman had started the comic book rush. So a lot of other companies were coming out to try to imitate. They were mostly publishing mysteries, westerns, and romance comics. However, during World War II, they launched a fairly small line of superheroes that included Captain America, Namor the Submariner, and the original Human Torch. So you actually have these characters actively fighting the Nazis and existing in their own small universe together. After the war, though, the demand for superhero comics kind of dropped off a bit. And Marvel started to shift back to romance comics, westerns, and other things, or timely rather, they weren't Marvel yet. Up until 1961, the company changed its name to Marvel and published Fantastic Four #1 the same year. Even though Fantastic Four is not a hot property now, it was one of the top comics for years, and it's the first superhero book that Stan Lee wrote. And he would go on to create a lot of other characters, including Spider-Man, Iron Man, Thor, and with the original artist for Captain America, he had it so that Captain America was supposedly frozen in ice for 20 years, so what you saw in the movie is in continuity, and brought back to form the Avengers. He also created the X-Men around the same time, and that was basically the beginning of the Marvel Universe. So the Marvel superheroes came 2 decades after DC hit, and as of 2009, Marvel is now completely owned by Disney. So that's a lot of years and a lot of comics. Many of the original titles in which superheroes first appeared are still being published. Just yesterday, Action Comics hit number 1,000. Detective Comics is about to do the same sometime, I think within the next year. And Amazing Spider-Man is about to hit number 800. And keep in mind, basically every major superhero has their own book. If it's a popular superhero like Batman, there's several Batman comics published each month, several Superman comics published each month. That's a lot to keep track of, and you're not going to be able to just buy everything. So a lot of what I'll be doing here is talking about how you can kind of sniff out what to buy for your collection, especially if you have a limited budget. So let's talk about some of what affects comic books. A run is when a single author or a author and writer team, or author and an artist team rather, stay on a comic for an extended period of time. These longer stories tend to be gathered in collections, and more often we are seeing collections come out with the author's actual names emphasized on them rather than just kind of being put on there in smaller font. And we'll talk about that more in a bit. Now, since you can't really keep a story going from 1939 without having some serious hiccups and some changing of ideas and really wanting to get rid of stuff, comics reboot regularly. There's often story-based things where some cataclysmic thing happens out in space or happens to the universe that resets things or makes it so that it's a new world with a fresh start, makes it so some things didn't happen, some things did. DC tends to do the reboot things more often. There was a crossover called Crisis on Infinite Earths, Infinite Crisis, Flashpoint as well. While just a couple years ago, Marvel had the Secret Wars crossover, which was a big combination of different worlds coming together, and in the end, it made the stories a lot smoother. They were able to say, a bunch of stuff didn't happen, here's how characters are changed, but we have a much easier timeline. A retcon is when elements of the past are changed in comics to make them fit a more modern narrative, or just to remove some baggage. So it can be very simple things, like obviously cell phones weren't in Spider-Man's origin back in the 60s. Now if they show a flashback, they might show a cell phone, they might show the internet and things like that. Or, things to reduce camp, stuff like that. But also things just to make stories simpler. Or there was a bad writer that was on a book for a while that made a questionable choice, and a future writer basically introduces some story element that casually says, yeah, that didn't happen. Then we have crossovers, which is one of the most important concepts in comics. How I mentioned these are all the same universe. Now, a couple of these titles are going to be familiar to you. Civil War was the subtitle of the third Captain America movie, and it was loosely based on that comic book plot. And when the Civil War comic came out about 10 years ago, more or less every major comic that was being published by Marvel tied into it somehow. So had stories that were related to what was happening in this big fight between Iron Man and Captain America. They were picking sides and so forth. We have Infinity War coming up as the next Avengers movie. A lot of that story is taken from Infinity Gauntlet, which was a story about Thanos wiping out half of the universe. Everybody got better, though, and half of the universe came back. And a few years back, when the Avengers films and the X-Men films were at their peak, Marvel decided to publish Avengers vs. X-Men as a big crossover and fight between characters because, in the reasons I'll explain shortly, the X-Men and the Avengers can't show up in movies together. So, I'm pointing these out because the crossovers are some of the most important comics that you can get. You want to look for stuff that usually each summer both of the publishers are doing some sort of crossover. They're easy buys, they sell tons, and even if you have people who are just following one or two characters, the crossovers tend to have a ton of characters and every character of significance. And crossovers now affect other media. It used to be that Warner Brothers would make a Batman movie, and it would be a standalone film. It might build off of the last Batman movie, but that's all that you needed to understand as a casual viewer. And then back in 2008, before Disney had bought out Marvel, Marvel got its own money to independently produce an Iron Man movie, with the plan being to create a whole universe. And we've seen how that's gone now that we're up to 18 movies. So all of this stuff where you have to keep track of years of plot and years of ideas just to be able to jump into a story, that's where we are now. So if any of you are fans of the movies or have seen some of the superhero movies but don't read the comics much, imagine having to explain to somebody the plot of all of the Marvel movies that led into Infinity War to somebody who hadn't seen any of them before they watch it. And that's what dealing with the comics is like, but on a larger scale. Now, I mentioned that Marvel is owned by Disney now. But the movies are something of a mess. Before Disney had bought out Marvel, Marvel had sold the rights to some of their properties to other film studios. So Fox had bought the rights to the X-Men characters, which includes Deadpool and Wolverine, the Fantastic Four, and Daredevil. Sony had bought the rights to Spider-Man. And the deal with both of them is that each studio had to keep making a film based on whatever property every few years in order to keep the rights. Otherwise, they would revert back to Marvel. So that's why you see these as separate things, at least in the films. And that's why we're now on our third reboot of Spider-Man. But this might be changing soon. We've already seen Spider-Man in the Marvel Universe. The deal with that is that Sony still owns the rights. But Sony made a deal for Marvel to produce the latest Spider-Man movie for them. They knew that the Marvel Avengers movies were highly popular, so having Spider-Man in them would make any Spider-Man films more popular. So if they're paying the money and letting Marvel make the films for them, then they're going to make a ton of cash off of that. Meanwhile, Disney got tired of not owning the X-Men films when they owned the X-Men comics and realized that there were several other Fox properties that were worth purchasing. So they are in the final stages of buying Fox outright. So pretty soon we're going to see the movies probably adjust so that the Avengers, the X-Men, and Spider-Man are all together. But I'm talking about the movies and TV because it gives you an idea of what to watch for what's going to be popular next, what characters to recommend to somebody who likes another character, um, and what you can build off of. If people have already watched something, being able to say, my library has a book that ties into this is useful. So let's keep going with some of the movies for a moment, and some of the television properties. So for Marvel, they don't keep their movies and TV separate. So you've probably heard about some of the Netflix shows that Marvel has done: Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, Punisher, and Iron Fist. Those all exist in the same universe as the Avengers movies, as Iron Man, as Black Panther, and so on. Runaways, which is based off of a comic series about teenage superheroes, or rather teenagers who find out that their parents are supervillains, is now on Hulu. And if you haven't picked up the comic for that, I would very strongly recommend it. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. spun out of the first Avengers movie, and up in the upper right you can see an image from Cloak and Dagger, which is a new Marvel show that's going to be coming on Freeform, which of course is a cable channel that used to be the Disney Channel. Meanwhile, DC keeps their movies and TV separate. So the Justice League film, the Batman vs. Superman film, all of that doesn't connect to what's happening on TV. And since Warner Brothers owns DC, and Warner Brothers owns most of the CW television network, most of the DC comic book shows are happening now on the CW. So we have Supergirl, The Flash, which is different than the version of The Flash in the movies, Green Arrow from the show Arrow, as well as a show called Legends of Tomorrow, all existing and interacting with each other. They'll do crossovers between shows and stuff like that. It's also worth mentioning that Gotham is on Fox now. It's a Batman prequel show that does not connect to the CW shows. For a long time, a lot of the different movies and TV shows that have been pushing comics and pushing their popularity have had white male leads. What has happened in the last year is very good. We are seeing more diversity in superheroes and in fandom. So I did this slide about a week ago. As of right now, Black Panther has made $659.5 million domestically and has been a critical hit. Wonder Woman last year was one of the most profitable movies for that year, and it actually made more money than the Justice League film that came out recently did. So the film that had Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman and so forth did not do as well as the film just focusing on Wonder Woman. And you can bet that the people who made it noticed that. So the film studios that own these comics are realizing that there is a market for female fans, for persons of color, etc. And one to watch out for is going to be Captain Marvel coming next year, which is the next big female-led superhero movie. If you don't already have some Captain Marvel books in your collection, I would very strongly suggest looking into this. So, something else to keep in mind with these years of different comics is that characters build off of traditions. And a lot of our new and diverse characters that have come out have some connection to some other superhero. Captain Marvel, who I just mentioned, she was originally Miss Marvel and was the female version of an alien superhero in the Marvel Universe. And that character died off decades ago. It's one of the few superhero deaths that hasn't been reversed. And for years, the female equivalent with the same powers was going around as Miss Marvel, until finally Marvel said, let's give her the gender neutral name. So that's the Captain Marvel comic that you see up there. I would recommend looking up anything by Kelly Sue DeConnick if you want to do some purchasing. And once the Miss Marvel name was cleared up, Marvel decided to add a new Miss Marvel that would be somewhat connected to Captain Marvel. And you can see a cover for one of the issues or for one of the collected volumes there. What's interesting is she is a Muslim American superhero by the name of Kamala Khan. And it's been a smash hit, especially with somewhat younger readers. In an odd thing that they did recently that was actually a critical hit, the role of Thor was taken over by a female character, Jane Foster, for a while. They just wrapped up that story arc, but it's worth checking out. And one thing that's an exception to the recent efforts at diversity is Black Panther. Black Panther has been around since the 60s. He first appeared in Fantastic Four before getting his own book. The current author of Black Panther is Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote Between the World and Me, The Beautiful Struggle, and other rather important best-selling books. He's planning to stick with Black Panther for quite a while, and he's going into some of the African roots of the character and doing a lot of research. Ta-Nehisi Coates is mostly known as an author dealing with particularly black problems within the United States. So it's interesting that he's picking up another comic this summer, which will be Captain America. And he's going to have to say a lot about American society and American issues. So keep an eye out for that, because we don't just want to focus on diverse characters, but also diverse creators. Now, that said, a lot of those characters that I just mentioned, as well as a few others, Marvel introduced in a big diversity push a couple of years back, and one of Marvel's executives said later on that basically more diverse books weren't selling. A lot of people have looked at the numbers and have been questioning that, but if we want diversity to continue in comics, if we want representation, we have to make sure that we have readers and we have fans who are excited. So any way that you can personally be a part of that is helping to make comics better. And again, how I mentioned that there's usually a legacy connection to different superheroes when you have more diverse characters. The last couple slides were Marvel. This is DC. So Batman is a lesbian superhero who has been popular in recent years and has had some excellent books with very high art quality. Batgirl, of course, has been around since the 60s, and has had a comic book for many years of that. Supergirl um, is Superman's cousin, has her own show, and I would strongly suggest looking up the Supergirl Rebirth books, which are some of the most recent ones and are a good jumping on point. And the Green Lanterns are basically a bunch of space cops who have multiple members from Earth, and you can see that they're not all simply white males. Moving on, though, I want to talk about some of the differences in comic books. You can't really think of superhero comics as a genre in itself rather than multiple genres. So Batman, he's a gritty detective who works out of Gotham City. He's a superhero who's a member of the Justice League, who goes into space and stuff. And we still have the campy 1960s television show. So, not even a single character often exists in a single genre. You can see here I have a comic that you can look at its cover and tell the Dark Side War one is more of a sci-fi thing. You can see some of the line work, some of the design, etc. That's more going to be more superhero-y, more action, more sci-fi. Somebody mentioned that Gotham Central is one of their favorite series, and if you haven't picked this one up for your library, I would strongly suggest it. I think it's collected in about 4 books. So just looking at the cover, you can tell that this is going to be more grounded to Earth. That it might not have people flying around in tights. That when you do see a supervillain or something like that, it's not going to go over the top or get cartoonish, and it's going to be more serious. And then the Batman Brave and the Bold cover is from one of the Batman cartoons. You can see it's cartoony, it's clearly drawn for younger viewers. It'll probably be more fun, more action oriented, but not too serious. So, really, once you have a collection in your library, a lot of what you do in terms of recommending materials to patrons is basic visual literacy. Look at the cover, flip through, you can get some idea of tone, pacing, etc. Flipping from DC back over to Marvel, Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, you can look at the cover and tell it's probably not too serious. That they intentionally make everybody look kind of weird, and it's going to be a joke comic. However, Amazing Spider-Man Death of Gwen Stacy, use common sense with that. If you've got a 7-year-old kid coming in and saying, I'd like a Spider-Man book, maybe that's not the one. And then Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., classic cover from decades ago, you can tell that it's going to be, somewhat psychedelic in style, but going to have that it's a visual representation of some of the twists and things that you have in a spy story. So when selecting items to purchase, you should also look for certain creators. That there's kind of this idea among non-comic readers that comic readers will just pick up anything, that they're not too serious about it, and so forth. That is very far from the truth, and even though Superman's been published for 1,000 issues, a lot of fans haven't stuck with it consistently. People jump on and jump off of books based off of creators, the quality of the writing, the quality of the art, and so forth. And a lot more now we are seeing collected editions that actually have the author's name large on there as part of the collected edition title. But when you're purchasing materials, let's say you want to get some Batman for your library. Instead of just randomly picking, try to figure out who wrote the series for a while and what you can pick up. See if you can get a certain story arc or a creator's run on it. And maybe when you have that fleshed out, move on to something else or someplace else. For me, I used to purchase graphic novels for 4 different libraries. And what I would do is I would pick a certain writer who I knew had a run on a comic, and I would put that run of it at one branch. I would then pick another writer who wrote Batman for a while and put all of that stuff at a different branch, and so forth. And since we have interlibrary loan that runs around for a while, or runs around 5 days a week, it was easy to say we have this whole chunk of the series over at another library. You can order all of that. And in some cases, I would even say I have volume 1 of the story arc at one branch. I'm going to put the rest, another copy of volume one and the whole run at another, so that people can still find the first one and know to look for the rest. And this is in the handout, but something that is highly useful for figuring out what to follow and what to buy is knowing what's popular right now. And Diamond Comics is the big distributor to the comic book shops. Each month, they release their previous month's statistics. And you can actually hop on, see what the top selling comics are, figure out what superheroes are popular right now, and you can't see it that well in this, but you'll be able to see when you go yourself, there's a link to more information about each comic. So this is for the individual issues, but if an individual issue is popular right now, it means a collected edition will be out in a few months, and you'll be able to pre-order. So by following this, you can figure out, okay, suddenly Thor is in the top 10 books. So there must be something happening with that, or a really good writer, or something like that. Let me do some research and figure that out. And you can figure out Jason Aaron is writing right now. It was just a big ending point for his stuff. And you can start purchasing for your library based on current demand. But I've mentioned everything with continuity and some ideas on trying to figure out of thousands of Batman stories, how do I get a chunk that is in the main storyline for my library? A good idea is to take a break from continuity. So a good place to go is Origins and Endings. It's for Superman books because it's hard to explain why, but for some reason, the strongest thing about Superman is the origin story. And I could actually pick like Superman Earth 1 or Superman the Man of Steel Volume 1 and add that here too. If you pick an origin, because these comics started so long ago, the origin stories get retread often. And they'll again tweak to try to modernize the character, to introduce new elements that relate to what a writer's been doing, and so forth. And you can usually buy these as standalones. So if you're trying to flesh out your Superman comics or your Batman comics or so forth, you can get Superman Birthright or Batman Year One and make it so that you have something where somebody can grab it from your shelf and go home with a story that is not 4 to 10 volumes, if not even more. And occasionally you get an alternate universe or alternate storyline ending. Like the last book there's All-Star Superman is supposed to be the last Superman story. And if you don't own it in your library, I've strongly suggested it's wonderful. But for comics that go on forever, and have a long middle but no definite end, a story that tells you how a writer would wrap this up has a certain appeal to it. On that same note, try to find Elseworlds and alternate universes. Elseworlds is a proper term within DC Comics. It's for stories that don't take place in continuity and have elements that are majorly changed. So, for example, Superman Red Sun is the story of what would have happened if Superman's spaceship landed in Russia during the Soviet era. Wolverine Old Man Logan is a future story of Wolverine, where he's old and grizzled and most of the Marvel Universe characters are dead. Age of Apocalypse is an alternate universe X-Men story. And of course, Batman The Dark Knight Returns, which should be in most libraries just because of popularity, is the story of an older Batman who had been retired picking up the cape again. So by finding a lot of these, you can maybe get one volume or just a few volumes to get a whole story, and you have the benefit of, if somebody knows the basic story but hasn't been following continuity deeply, they can pick up a book, read it, and be done and move on to the next thing without being confused or discouraged. I'd also like to do a quick plug for some of the DC Comics animated movies. So, while Marvel is doing better in movie theaters, DC's home offerings are excellent. They're usually self-contained stories. They're adapted from story arcs, and very often, like with Gotham by Gaslight or their adaptation of The Dark Knight Returns, they're based off of alternate continuity or Elseworld stories. So if you do circulate DVDs in your collection and are looking for ways to attract some of your fans to different media, check this out. And somebody mentioned that the animated Suicide Squad movie that they did is better than the actual Suicide Squad movie. There's usually video games that tie into, or there's comics that tie into video games and movies as well. Like, for example, the Arkham series of video games were very popular with Batman for a while. That was Arkham Asylum, Arkham City, Arkham Knight. There's a whole bunch of different comics based off of that, and they're not tied into the bigger DC continuity, so they're easier to pick up and read quick. The same with the Injustice video game, which is a play on Justice League, which has Superman going evil, taking over the world, Batman launching a resistance, etc. The comics for it are surprisingly good. And for Marvel especially, whenever they do a movie, they do some tie-in comics to that. Like, there's already an Avengers Infinity War prequel comic that has stuff that's supposed to be leading up to the event. So be sure to check that out, because it's often a gateway into the broader continuity. But it's written as if it's in a separate universe, a separate timeline, and so forth. You're looking for superhero comics for kids. I know that this is overly simplistic, but something you want to look for is kid-friendly comics. Or not kid-friendly, the word adventures. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a moment. So Batman Adventures, Superman Adventures were both by DC, but Marvel had a whole line called Marvel Adventures. And they just released a Black Panther volume that's not new material, but it's collected stuff that doesn't have anything inappropriate, that they call Black Panther Adventures. The only exception I can think of is that there used to be a series called Adventures of Superman that they recently did as a digital comic too. There's some collected editions that have that, which, while definitely not inappropriate for kids, isn't made for kids. But just look out for anything with that word in the title. That's probably a good clue. Likewise, try to figure out what cartoons are coming out. So confusingly, there was an Ultimate Spider-Man cartoon and an Ultimate Spider-Man comic that was not geared towards kids. But they did do a tie-in comic for the cartoon, and you can get some collected volumes of that. Likewise, the DC Superhero Girls comic has been a hit lately. We can't keep it on the shelf, and it's based off a cartoon that's happening now. You can also get the DVDs. They've done a couple direct-to-video movies for this, but there is a Scooby-Doo team-up series. Since Scooby-Doo is owned by Warner Brothers, as is DC Comics, they just keep tossing Scooby and the gang in with different DC superheroes. But when trying to figure out age appropriateness, there are ratings on comics. Marvel and DC have mildly different systems, but it's actually broken up more than you might expect. So, all ages is absolute all ages. A is 9 and up. For some reason, they don't have T on here, but T is kind of younger teen, even tween appropriate. T plus is supposed to basically be a PG-13. And then they have parental advisory for older teens to adults. So parental advisory still means 15 and up is their recommendation. And then you get to max, which is the full-on adult. You can see DC's rating system you can find online as well. Not very different. They changed the A to an E. But other than that, you can pick up a book, flip to the back, look near the UPC code, and usually find the appropriate age. And each of the publishers has an adult imprint. Marvel has Max, which you won't see that often, which usually has characters that are part of continuity. Sometimes the books are in continuity, sometimes they're not. The first series that was published under that was Jessica Jones, which is now adapted as a Netflix series. Vertigo doesn't usually do stuff with superheroes. Most famously, the Vertigo imprint of DC published Sandman, which was written by Neil Gaiman and basically launched his career. Now, I'm not going to say too much on the adult comics, but I do want to make a point. If any of you are arguing with somebody about whether you should be allowed to have collections that are explicitly targeting adults, Deadpool was rated R, as was the last Wolverine movie, Logan. Jessica Jones on Netflix and the other Netflix Marvel shows are TVMA. A DVD version of Batman v Superman, the extended version, is rated R. And Walking Dead, even though not superhero, is based off of a comic. So there is demand for this. It's a product that people know. It would be like not getting the book of a rated R movie. Even though there's pictures and you might be seeing a bit more, it's still often worth having in your collection. I would say this especially for some of the Vertigo titles like Sandman. Now, as a last thing, I want to go briefly into digital comics. I don't know if any of you have Hoopla, but if you do, the comic collection is superb. Hoopla, I see multiple attendees typing, so I assume yes. Hoopla, I used to say to patrons until a few months back, they have every major comic publisher except for Marvel. Then they got Marvel. And Beyond just thinking of Hoopla as a resource for getting comics to your patrons, I strongly suggest using it as a resource to figure out what to buy, or if a patron gets a book of something and wants to know what's next, it can often help you find the next volume of something. So here I have Action Comics circled next to one of the volumes with it. When you click on that, you see just some of the recent volumes of Action Comics, and you see them in order. Now, somebody had a question about, does the content come straight from Hoopla, or is it purchased? It is straight from Hoopla. They are trying to target mostly the newer stuff and then fill back catalog. So usually the day that DC publishes a new trade paperback, it's in Hoopla. Marvel, they're kind of trying to catch up, and that's why it's scattershot. But they've done certain things, like when the last season of Jessica Jones came out, they made a point of bringing in new volumes. And since Disney owns Marvel, Marvel now publishes, and Disney owns Star Wars, Marvel now publishes the Star Wars comics. When the last movie came out, they made a point of loading up a whole bunch of Star Wars product on there. But in addition to Hoopla, I would strongly suggest checking out Comixology.com, because I know that with everybody, you sometimes trying to figure out series orders and things like that, you might look at Fantastic Fiction or something like that, but sometimes Amazon or other sites can be useful. Comixology is actually owned by Amazon. They don't have a library service, but it doubles as basically a search engine that is just comic books. So I know that was a lot, but I want to put my email address out there. If anybody would like recommendations for what to buy, if you have questions like, I have a patron who is interested in this or interested in that, I want to know how to get more of this, I will gladly respond to you. I am also typing up a guide to some recent comics, some recent story arcs, as well as a lot of, here's some origin comics that you can buy one volume and have a Spider-Man or an Incredible Hulk or whatever story, or here's some Elseworlds, here's some things that you can use to flesh out your collection without having to buy too much. If you'd like a copy of that guide sometime next week, just shoot me an email, and you can also add questions for what you would like to see in that. All right, so I think that mostly covers it. Does anybody have any other questions or comments that they'd like to bring up before we wrap? I have a question here about shelving graphic novels. What I would suggest with that is, so I like the way that my library system does it. We do fiction by author, but for comics we do, like, let's say it's Batman volume 5 of whatever. It is F for fiction, BAT for Batman, rather than focusing on the author. And sometimes it'll be volume 5, for example, there. And usually leave it up to the pages to figure out what story arcs tie together and so on. But make it so that whatever character stays with whatever character. Even if you get the authors or the order jumbled with Batman or Spider-Man or whatever, all of your Batmans together, because people are often looking for whatever character. On ordering collections from past years, I would say to a limited degree. Something that's happened in recent years is that the word count has gone down. That it used to be that actually comic writers used to be paid by the word, and it would show back in the 40s. So they read differently. They read faster and they depend a lot more on the artwork to tell the story. So some of the stuff from the 60s or 70s can be a bit jarring. I would get a few. I would look for collections that are clearly advertised as select best of stories from whatever decade, but not focus on that too much. Ah, difference between a graphic novel and a comic. Graphic novel is a fuzzy word. Um, and it was originally coined by Will Eisner, who was a comic book artist and writer for years. He wrote actually an autobiographical story, so it was nonfiction, but he called it a graphic novel to distinguish it between the supposedly lowbrow comic book. Um, Sometimes graphic novels refer to something that is specifically highbrow or higher art. Sometimes people use it to refer to any collected edition. But among fans, anything like comic or graphic novel is perfectly fine. That we usually don't turn our nose up at either. Anything that has, pictures with word balloons counts as a comic or a graphic novel. I'm in kind of I'm in a more rural system, and I notice that I make a point of going to other libraries regularly, and basically, the more the population is, the more you see adult graphic novels actually moving. Um, Saga is an absolutely excellent series. It is also a hard R, I would say, if you were to rate it like a movie. It's um, but it has, even within my system, it's been moving well enough to justify owning. We do keep our young adult graphic separate from our adult graphic and make sure that they're segregated off. Um, but what's been interesting is I've had teens who have gotten older, teens that I got hooked on Runaways years ago, which is also by the same author, Brian K. Vaughan, and it exists in the Marvel Universe. And a lot of these creators, once they get popular, writing something within DC or Marvel, they move on to do creator-owned work, often published by Image or through a deal with one of the other two. But I've been able to introduce teens that I had reading Young Runaways, which is a teen-friendly book, to Saga once they get older. But it's something to look out for as well. If you figure out that somebody really likes a certain author and they're older, look and see if you have any of their independent stuff or can get it.
Okay, great work with those questions. There were a lot of them. Excellent presentation, Brian. It's all just Superman to me, but it's nice to see all the differences. I see someone's picking them apart. I want to thank you all for being so active today and asking questions and telling us what you knew about it. That was pretty cool. And I want to thank Brian for an excellent presentation. And you're right, we do need more on these things at PCI Webinars. And if anybody else is interested in putting one together, please let us know. So thanks everybody for coming, and hope you have a great afternoon. I hope to see you again soon at PCI Webinars. Thanks.
Thank you.